I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science, health, and medicine.
We know 90% of what people should be doing to be healthy, and we know what the unhealthy foods are. If your goal is to get on the television, sell a book, sell a product, you can't just say have, fresh fruit and veg a lot, exercise, because people are like, okay, boring. You've got to come up with some new science.
Why are people using CGMs? I mean, is there any role for using CGMs if you don't have any issues with glucose control?
We don't basically know what the glucose means, and it is causing so much anxiety that I see and so much confusion. It's wild to me there's no evidence at all out there that this is harmful. There's lots of indirect evidence it's absolutely fine and normal. And I think it's people trying to sell CGMs.
So what is the science behind ultra-processed foods?
I think based on the evidence, yes, you can in fact have ultra-processed foods in the diet and remain absolutely healthy. I would die of shock if supermarket bread is ever shown to be remotely related to negative health outcomes ever.
Nicola, thank you so much for joining me.
Not at all, pleasure.
I've used to, follow your Substack and read all of these articles that you wrote about all this misinformation and pseudoscience online. But it seems now we really are in a new golden age of pseudoscience and misinformation, particularly when it comes to podcasts. And there seems to be a plethora of health podcasts out there at the moment that exist purely for the sake of farming likes and engagement by saying very controversial things, polarizing opinions. And it just seems to be a complete mess out there. And for the average person who's maybe not medical at all, who just wants to improve their health, it can be very difficult to separate what is the truth from what is pseudoscience and what is flat out misinformation. So why are we in this state at the moment where there's so much misinformation? And number two, how can someone listening to any bit of health advice online actually know what seems legit or what seems untrustworthy?
I think there are three things why we have this. I think firstly, social media has offered an opportunity to make people a lot of money in a fairly easy way. Like if you're a doctor, you go through all of this training. If you go into clinical trials, it's decades of work before you get any attention. Which brings me to my second point is we have an attention economy. Everything is about eyeballs and clicks. And so if you're able to exploit social media to get attention, that is a great way of making money. And I think the third thing, and maybe we'll touch on this, the thing that disappoints me the most is that a lot of the misinformation isn't necessarily coming from the crazy people who bought their PhD online. It's actually coming from people who've received training, the right kind of training, and should know better. And I wonder whether it's because, I do research. I don't know if you've ever been involved in clinical trials, but my goodness, it's a hell of a lot of work. It's a lot of, drudge work, being awake until 2 a.m., writing the finances out. It's solving problems, it's bureaucracy. It's not particularly glamorous or exciting. And two, frankly, the money's not that great. And so I can see how now that there is this opportunity to earn a lot of money without having to sit awake until 2 a.m. writing a grant, that people take that opportunity and they're able to use their vocabulary and their credentials to make a lot of money really quickly.
To pick up on that point you made about the misinformation, a lot of that coming from medical professionals, healthcare professionals with credentials and who have been to university and done research and studied for many years to achieve a level of respect in academia or beyond. That brings me on to the point about the continuous glucose monitors
Right.
and the CGMs. And obviously, being a doctor in the hospital, I've seen diabetics wear these over the years. I've seen friends and family who are diabetics have, these devices, and they're very useful. We know they're game changers for people who have pathology. But then I've seen so many of these influencers or medical content creators or educators online who should know better, who are then advocating for normal people to use these. And that's when, a few years back when I saw this, I was optimistic and I thought, hang on, there may be some value here, and let me look into the research. And the more I read things from reading Twitter threads from the likes of yourself and your Substack and doing my own research, I realized, hang on, there really doesn't seem to be much argument here for normal people with no diabetes, no pre-diabetes or insulin resistance to be using these, unless you're a ultra marathon runner or an athlete looking to get that extra 0.1%.
Right.
So really, why are people using CGMs? I mean, is there any role for using CGMs if you don't have any issues with glucose control?
On the balance of the evidence, I don't think so. So it's really important to note that firstly, glucose almost certainly in people without pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes ever gets to a concentration that is directly causing harm. So of course, in diabetes, there's value in these devices because glucose can get to a level that directly causes harm. And so enabling people to take action to reduce that is a good thing. That isn't the case in people without pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. So if glucose isn't pathological, you don't need to intervene to lower glucose acutely. And the second point related to that is in people without diabetes and indeed with type 2 diabetes, glucose is a symptom of everything that's going on underneath. So even if you were to say, oh, I just want to catch pre-diabetes early, pre-diabetes, well, actually, the glucose is a symptom of the underlying damage and you need to fix that underlying damage, which if you're relying on your glucose level to tell you what to do, it's going to mislead you. And let me give you an example. Like I've seen the Glucose Goddess and others kind of say, oh, dress your carbs. So this idea, I mean, I've seen it even with fruit, like my goodness, if you have mango or blueberries, dress them in Greek yogurt to lower the glucose spike. Like, again, like I said, the glucose isn't getting into a concentration that causes you harm. But if you are adding some calories and or saturated fat to the fruit, what you're doing is possibly increasing your likelihood of getting some insulin resistance. The effect is probably small, but two, you're adding calories in unnecessarily when the absolute primary thing that most people should do is manage their weight to prevent type 2 diabetes. So it's giving you very perverse and misleading and possibly even damaging advice by this glucocentric approach to nutrition.
Say someone is health conscious and they believe these online influencers and they buy themselves a subscription to one of these CGM glucose devices, a little circle on their arm, and they're looking at the readings. What is a glucose spike for someone who has no idea about glucose physiology? What is a spike, and what difference does it make to a normal person without diabetes and then to a person with diabetes, and why is it harmful in that case?
So, I mean, the thing is about spike, there's no definition. It basically, my understanding, and I think most people's, is it means when your glucose goes up quite a lot after you eat. If you have a carbohydrate containing food, it's natural your glucose goes up and it should come back down again because the pancreas responds with releasing insulin. And the difference between people without diabetes and with is, number one, the concentration that glucose gets to, so the magnitude of increase, but number two, the duration of that glucose spike. So you are exposed to a much higher concentration of glucose, number one, but you will be exposed to that higher concentration of glucose for much longer. And this is what people miss. I mean, the thing that really annoys me, and I'm sure many consultants in the hospital are also seeing this, when a glucose spike has been defined as my glucose got to a diabetic level, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what diabetes is. Diabetes is chronically elevated blood glucose. If you have type 2 diabetes, your fasting glucose may well be above 7 the whole night. When you eat something, it might be going up to 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It might never get below 7. So you are chronically and constantly exposed to a high concentration of glucose. And based on pretty much most of what we understand, that is a lot of the damage, because glucose at that concentration for a long, long time can be toxic to the cells. Now, people do talk about, what about the peaks and troughs? Surely that adds some extra damage. And we think there might be in diabetes. So if it's going up and down and up and down, independent of what your overall glucose level is, just the oscillating glucose itself might be damaging. But this surprises people. Even in diabetes, we are not absolutely sure whether that is the case, whether oscillating glucose explains much more than overall exposure to chronically elevated glucose. So I always emphasize that, because what are we talking about with a glucose spike in an otherwise healthy person? It's going up high for 20 minutes, not even as high as you'd get in diabetes, and it's coming back down again. It's wild to me. There's no evidence at all out there that this is harmful. There's lots of indirect evidence it's absolutely fine and normal. And I think it's people trying to sell CGMs.
And you mentioned there that, I think you alluded to the point earlier, that there are some people who are trying to use this as an asymptomatic screening tool, and that's how they're justifying the use of these. Explain why that doesn't make sense for someone who maybe has had some baseline blood tests, a few months ago, and their HbA1c, a marker of their long-term glucose control, is normal. Their fasting blood sugars is also normal. And they've decided to wear this device to just pick up chronically elevated spikes. Why is that not a good screening tool for pre-diabetes or even pre-diabetes to make these better health choices?
The short answer is it's because we don't know what normal looks like. We don't know what any of these spikes mean. And there's also, in general, a lack of validation of these tools in measuring glucose. There's a lot of error. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and they're not standardized. So, of course, there are limitations to any blood test, but your doctor will have your medical history. So they'll be able to choose the right glucose screening tool for you, whether it's hemoglobin A1c, which is like you said, the long-term measure, whether it's taken a fasting glucose on the day or a glucose tolerance test. They're standardized. We can compare your data to hundreds of thousands of other people and put it into context with what it means. We simply don't have that with the CGMs. So there's error there's variance between the devices, depending on a multitude of things you might have done in the previous couple of days or the day before. That's going to affect your glucose. We don't basically know what the glucose means. And it is causing so much anxiety that I see, and so much confusion. And I see patients in my clinic. So I see people who've been diagnosed with pre-diabetes or even type 2. And so when I get on, in the clinic appointment with people, and I sort of say, okay, so I can see that you've been diagnosed with pre-diabetes, and we talk about it. And then I always do a screening. So I'm like, okay, what's your A1C? And they've said like 31, 35, like normal, right? So pre-diabetes starts at 42. And people are coming to me, and it's this super low or normal hemoglobin A1C. And so I'm like, okay, that sounds like you've got normal blood glucose. Why do you think you've got pre-diabetes? Oh, well, I wore a CGM and my glucose gets to pre-diabetes levels. And it doesn't. And maybe that's worth going into is what pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes levels are, for example, on a standardized test like a glucose tolerance test. So this is what I see is when you have a glucose tolerance test, we diagnose, if diagnose is the right word, pre-diabetes if your 2-hour glucose is like 7.8. So 7.8 millimoles per litre or above. But that's 2 hours after you take a glucose drink. And of course, if your glucose is still that high 2 hours after a glucose drink, it's an indication something's wrong, because in healthy people, it would have come down. And it's the timing there that's really important. And instead, what I see is people have this misunderstanding, and it's not their fault. They are being told, I think, by folks trying to sell these CGM devices, oh, my glucose got to a pre-diabetic level when I had toast. It's actually utterly normal and healthy for your glucose to get to 7.8 if you have toast or carbohydrate within 30 to 40 minutes of eating that food. That's utterly normal and healthy. The point is, it comes back down again.
And I think that's the problem, really. I mean, we have got people now pathologizing glucose, similar to how people have historically pathologized cortisol. I think These chemicals in our body are neither good nor bad. They serve a function, and in extreme low states and extreme high states, they can be problematic for some people. And we've got homeostasis and normal physiological mechanisms which can balance it in the average person. And I actually tried a CGM for myself to show people why, it's so superfluous for the average person. And I ate a chicken wing, which is 100 calories for one chicken wing, and it's full of fat. And I ate an apple, a medium-sized apple, which is around 80 or 90 calories, full of sugar. Obviously the apple spiked my blood sugar on my CGM device more than the chicken wing. And I think it would be wrong to say that the apple is inherently worse for you than a fried chicken wing. But as according to CGM, if we just look at the glucose spikes, the apple spiked my glucose more than the chicken wing. And if you listen to these CGM zealots and glucose zealots online, they would make you believe that that is decaying your body or disrupting your body in some way purely because of that glucose spike. And I wonder, like you mentioned as well, how it's causing anxiety, this obsessive tracking of glucose. I have seen anecdotally some patients with gallstones in clinics who have actually got a worsening of their symptoms because they're wearing CGMs. And I just asked them incidentally, your history online doesn't suggest any evidence of diabetes. Is there a reason why you're wearing these devices? And they're saying they're trying to be healthier and tracking what they eat. And actually their symptoms with their gallstones were worse because they were increasing the amount of fat in their diet to artificially blunt their glucose response, like trying to manufacture a flat line of glucose so their readings look great, but that's impacting their overall health and other conditions. Are you seeing a lot more of that in the patients that you see as well and in general people?
Yes. And if I were to say if there's one thing that I am most concerned about, and in fact that I see the most, it is a rise in LDL cholesterol in people who are trying to follow this glucocentric approach. Because like you say, they are focusing on, healthy eating means lowering my glucose. And so naturally they tend to follow a higher fat diet. A lot of high fat foods have more saturated fat in them. And some people only need a small amount of extra saturated fat in the diet to push their LDL cholesterol up. And I think the really important thing to know, even in type 2 diabetes, which is a condition diagnosed via high blood glucose, we don't just pay attention to glucose. Because in diabetes, what sadly kills people is heart attacks and strokes. So it's high blood pressure and LDL cholesterol, it's lipids that we need to pay attention to. And I always think how perverse that is, that we have this glucocentric approach in people who don't need to be concerned about their glucose. And it's leading them to take steps that could actually be worsening their other risk factors. Because across the population, I think around half of people, depending on how you define it, have a cholesterol level that's high enough to be a contributing factor to cardiovascular disease and other things. And I think it's probably around a third, even higher, who have hypertension. So those are the things, my goodness, we should be focusing on. But we're not, because someone hasn't developed this tiny, very convenient, sexy little device that is going to be giving people this biofeedback. And I think that's very, very worrying. And so, yes, that's what I see in my clinic. These things I think could be doing harm.
Do you think that there are things that people ought to be tracking, even if not on a daily basis, maybe on a weekly basis? And this is assuming you don't have any chronic health conditions. For the average person looking to better their health, are there any variables or metrics worth keeping an eye on?
That's a great question. And I think actually it really speaks to your point about gallstones, that people are worsening other aspects of their health. Like health is lots of things. And focusing on just glucose is very misleading, even in diabetes, like I said. And just to add that a lot of these CGM companies will say, get insight into your metabolism. Now, glucose in someone without diabetes tells you actually very little, if negligible amounts about your metabolism. So that's really important. In terms of what, though, is valuable, what I want to know about as a reasonably healthy person who wants to stay healthy, my blood pressure, cholesterol, so LDL cholesterol particularly, resting heart rate, because it means I've got a strong heart and hopefully that's going to help me to live a long time. Muscle mass, so being strong and functional over a long period of time. and maybe insulin. Like if you wanted something that's going to tell you about your metabolism and how metabolically healthy you are, insulin is far better than glucose in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, for me, even though there's no guidelines to suggest that this is the case, I believe that probably over the age of 30, I mean, this is again purely an arbitrary number, it's probably worth most people, if they've not in their lifetime had it, getting a baseline set of blood tests just to check some of those metrics that you mentioned, like your cholesterol, etc. For men, potentially something like testosterone, just to see at what range it's in. Is there factors in your life that you could change to improve that, such as your sleep, etc.? And on your points of people obsessing over glucose and thinking that is the reading that matters, a lot of these CGM companies claim that their benefits can be extended towards your sleep and your focus and your energy. And they're actually forgetting that your focus and energy and concentration, etc., that's all because of high glucose, usually. You get those benefits of improved cognition because your glucose is probably normal/high, because it needs to be high. Your body is making it high so you can function better. When my glucose is low, I know I feel lethargic and I feel a bit grumpy and my reflexes and energy are not quite right. So I think it's almost false advertising for these companies to suggest that lowering your glucose spike or being aware of that has anything to do with all of these wide-reaching facets of everyday biology.
Yeah, like I see where they're talking about it, very often it's the peaks and troughs. So it's like this roller coaster of glucose that I was talking about. And like I said, even in diabetes, we are not entirely sure how important that is or whether it matters. So very likely it doesn't in people without diabetes. But the thing that worries me even more is the evidence that's being used to make these claims. So, for example, there's a company that have cross-sectional data, and they've used this cross-sectional data to find a relationship between peaks and troughs, so that roller coaster, and things like hunger and energy. But cross-sectional data is the weakest type of data we have. This is the kind of data where you get those spurious associations of, if you buy an iPhone on Tuesday, you're more likely to have Crohn's disease. It's sort of meaningless. And I going back to the first point you made about this misinformation, what bothers me is that it's coming from scientists who have this product they want to sell. They've got all of this data and people are paying this company to give them their health data. The company are then analyzing this data, doing trash science, frankly, to publish these spurious associations to say, aha, look, there's a relationship between these roller coasters and energy and all of those things. So buy our product. Whereas, in fact, the stronger evidence, the randomized experimental evidence, has not shown relevant relationships between peaks and troughs of glucose and things like appetite, hunger, energy, and all of those things.
So I think, some of that data dredging, as you can call it, just looking at random observations and correlations is being used to prove a causation, which it's not. And I think ultimately there'll be a lot of people watching this who, are sort of really fixated and love their CGMs, even if they're not diabetic, and they might be resistant to hearing some of these myths being broken here. But also for people listening who maybe are diabetic or have some issue with glucose regulation, what are some actual actionable things that someone can do to actually regulate their glucose levels, whether it's during a meal or during a day, nutritionally, or any hacks that someone can do?
So I would make a distinction here between someone with and without diabetes, because I think there are some hacks that actually are really useful for people with type 2 diabetes. So, for example, meal ordering. There is very good evidence that just simply changing the order of how you eat lowers blood glucose. So if you're having a meal, having particularly the protein before, so that might be the chicken, the tofu, or whatever you're choosing to have as your protein, even having maybe some salad or vegetables and then consuming the carbohydrate. That is really effective at lowering glucose. It's a great thing to do because you haven't got to change what you eat. It's the order with which you consume it. But why don't I recommend that for people without prediabetes or type 2 diabetes? It's simply because you don't need to worry about your glucose. And I worry that we are turning meals into scientific experiments. And food is meant to be enjoyed, the socialization aspect. And like we talked about with other risk factors, I would much prefer, if people are going to pay attention and, give their brain energy to something, do it to things like blood pressure, where having fruits and stuff like that is going to help lower your blood pressure, and do it with having healthy fat. So pay attention to that. I worry about encouraging people to do things that are simply not necessary. So that's one hack that I think is really good, great for people with type 2 diabetes. I also, in my practice a lot, I kind of use a high protein diet that seems to be very effective for managing glucose. And it can lower glucose a lot without needing to lose weight, which is very useful. But again, why don't I recommend that for people without diabetes? Because it's not necessary, and you should simply have a healthy diet that you enjoy.
The high protein diet and its role in regulating blood glucose, do you think that's because the higher protein foods are more voluminous and more satiating, so thereby you might consume less calories or less likely to overconsume calories? Or is there another mechanism by which
mechanistically what they do, and actually some of the food order studies have shown this, is when protein gets broken down into amino acids in the blood. And what we know is amino acids are great at getting the pancreas to produce insulin. And this is really necessary and important in type 2 diabetes, because as you develop type 2 diabetes, particularly if you've had it for a couple of years or longer, the beta cells of the pancreas are less sensitive to glucose in your blood. And what that means is, so in a healthy person, if you have like some toast for breakfast, your glucose will go up. You have a sensor on your pancreas that recognizes, oh gosh, glucose is going up. Let's produce some insulin. That happens in healthy people. That sensor doesn't work as well in people without type 2 diabetes, and it works terribly in people who've had type 2 diabetes for a long time. What happens is you eat those 2 slices of bread, your blood glucose goes up, your pancreas doesn't recognize it because the sensor doesn't work. But the pancreas and the sensor remain sensitive to amino acids, even if you've had type 2 diabetes for, we think, quite a long time. So if you have a lot of protein with your meal, or you have protein first, those amino acids tell the pancreas produce some insulin, and you can really help lower particularly the after meal glucose. So that's what we think the primary mechanism is.
Well, that's really interesting, actually. I think that's a useful hack. And I guess for diabetics as well, if they combine that with resistance training and the high protein, more muscle or increased muscle protein synthesis potentially, which can then also sensitize cells. Well, the muscle cells can uptake glucose a bit more, and it also help to, contribute to that regulation of the glucose. So I guess it's like a win-win scenario in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. Your muscles are a massive reservoir for glucose. So the bigger they are and the more they work, the more glucose they'll suck out of the bloodstream. So absolutely. And I would just add, I'm not a carnivore advocate in the sense that it's a high meat, high saturated fat diet. You can have high protein, and I encourage lots of plants in there. Even if they're low carb plants, having nuts, seeds, lots of fiber in there. So even though you're getting the high protein, I always focus on all of the other cardiovascular risk factors as well. So you want to keep your saturated fat intake low, lots of veggies and fruits, so that you're keeping your blood pressure low as well.
What are your thoughts on this kind of trend of, I say it's a trend, but it's just, it keeps having its peaks and troughs, and it's currently having its moment again, I guess, where people are advocating for the use of apple cider vinegar to blunt glucose spikes as well. And looking into the literature, there seems to be some minimal data to suggest that there may be something there, but clearly, this is a small win if it exists at all.
Yeah, so I think the effect is real. It's not massive, but I just think of all the other things that you could do to lower your glucose, it's one, unpleasant. Two, I'm not a gastro expert, but I can't imagine having something that acidic going down your esophagus frequently is a good thing. And the other point as well, and it comes back to, does lowering glucose acutely, so does taking steps to blunt this glucose spike in the short term have benefits over the long term? And again, I go back to the fact that if your glucose is getting too high, it's because you have underlying damage. So you have insulin resistance and your beta cells are probably failing. And to fix those things, you can lose weight. That's effective in anyone, even people who are relatively lean. If you have a large waist circumference or fat around the middle, losing weight is going to fix your beta cells. It's going to fix your liver fat. It's going to fix your insulin resistance. It's going to lower your blood pressure and all of the other things. Exercise is a better choice to lower glucose acutely, and it's going to improve the underlying damage. Having more fruits and veggies is going to make you more insulin sensitive. So you put all of the different things that you could do that are hopefully pleasant, enjoyable, fun to lower your glucose, and you compare it to apple cider vinegar. I mean, I've never in my clinical career ever recommended anyone have apple cider vinegar to blunt a glucose spike, and I never will.
I think this CGM trend is emblematic of the wider problem of people wanting, and the people wanting personalized healthcare is not a problem in itself, but I guess it's the onus of the companies to then outline the limitations of these things. And I think the next thing I worry about is something which revolves around the gut health space and the microbiome. We've seen an uptake in the number of people promising at-home microbiome testing, like stool sample testing. Now, as a surgeon in the NHS, the stool testing that I'm used to, seeing patients have is a fecal occult blood test at home for the, bowel cancer screening program. You get a bit of, a kit sent at home. You poo onto this stick essentially, and that gets analyzed for blood. That's a very easy, low-hanging fruit to test potentially for bowel cancer, or at least a suspicion index for bowel cancer. And then you've got lab-grade assays for microbiome testing, which are quite expensive, used for fecal microbiota transplants, poo transplants, etc. And those cost thousands of pounds in a lab. But then you've got consumer-grade poo testing, and I must admit, I haven't looked in detail at the evidence behind this, but I cannot imagine how someone can take a lab grade test, which costs a lot of money, and then make that available for, £100 or dozens of pounds at home, and then tell you we can analyze your entire microbiome based on this. And not only that, we can then tell you what specifically you can eat based on this 50, £100 home test. Surely there is no, solid science behind that.
So I can't comment on how valid the kind of shotgun metabolomic type approach is for analyzing the microbiome. People I trust who do that kind of work tell me, no, it can't. It cannot do what people are claiming it can do. But I can speak to whether these kinds of tests are able to personalize your diet. And the answer is no. There's two academic groups who also have a commercial product who do this, and they simply haven't published any data whatsoever showing that their offer is able to personalize diets. So when I think about this, when I read about this like 5 years ago, and they said, oh, we're going to analyze the microbiome to see what diets people should have. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, so like maybe if people have more of the kind of bacteria that can metabolize carbohydrates, the algorithm would recommend a higher carb diet. Maybe other people, they're better able to metabolize protein. I was expecting to see meaningful dietary recommendations that were different. And then one of the first groups, and it was a big paper published in Cell in 2015, this idea that, we've personalized diets. And hidden deep in the supplementary data was the dietary breakdown of what their algorithm recommended. And it was a low carb diet. And that made sense to me, because if you look at what they're doing, and lots of these companies are now similar, they kind of say, we're going to take your microbiome data and we'll take your glucose data and we'll put it all together in machine learning. And it sounds very cutting edge, and we'll give you these recommendations. And I think all their algorithm did is look at what people's glucose responses to food was acutely. And guess what? Carbohydrate foods push the glucose up, and high fat and high protein foods don't. So it recommended a high fat, high protein diet to everyone. That's not personalization. And more recently, there's a company in the UK that published some data, and it looks like their algorithm recommended a pretty healthy diet. I mean, it's plant-based, it's reducing ultra-processed food, like great, but it's not the promise of this personalized nutrition. And it's not a surprise to me, and I'm a real cynic, that none of these companies have ever tried to test the reproducibility of their product. So I don't know if you remember, like 10 years ago, where food intolerance tests were all the rage. You know, you test your skin or test your hair with things, and it would give you a long readout of foods you can and cannot tolerate. And I think it was Which magazine or someone else did like a secret shopper. So they went and had this food tolerance test twice. And one time the test said you absolutely cannot have tomatoes, and the other time it didn't. And I would bet quite a bit of money that these tests are equally unreproducible, that someone takes your microbiome on a Monday and says, these are the foods you can and can't have, and do it on Tuesday, and I think it would tell you something different.
Yeah, I mean, I can't buy the personalized nutrition aspect when, you know, you recommend essentially a healthy diet, nothing wrong with that, as you suggested, more plants, more fiber, etc., and a range of different things. And then naturally, if the average person increases their fiber intake, and we know in the Western world, most people probably have a fiber deficient diet. If they increase their fiber content because of this money they've spent, thus they're, you know, heeding to the recommendations at least for a few weeks or a few months, and they even increase their fiber intake by 10 grams a day, they're gonna poo better. They're gonna probably lower their cholesterol. They're gonna have all of these extra benefits of simply increasing their fiber and eating more plant-rich foods and the antioxidants, etc. And they're probably going to account those health benefit improvements and those metric improvements to XYZ company, which offers this personalization, rather than just realizing I've just eaten more fiber and I'm pooing more.
I mean, I think so. And it's very difficult when you're a consumer, because all the things that you're talking about are like confounding factors and things. So, you know, if you have a trial and the group that gets the personalized nutrition gets a bunch more coaching, and the group that has the generic advice doesn't, obviously the group that got the personalized advice is going to get better outcomes because they've got more coaching. They're going to stick to a healthy diet better. And it's really sexing up, like you said. It's just nothing wrong with having a healthy diet. Have more plants, have less ultra processed foods, fabulous. But it's this packaging up of this science in a way that you kind of know the public are probably not going to notice. You just say, oh, we did a randomized control trial. It's the gold standard. And most of the public are going to go, wow, they've actually tested their personalized nutrition intervention in a gold standard program. Whereas actually, if you look at the data, it's coaching. Like you said, people are paying, either they're paying more money, they're getting more coaching, and they're just sticking to healthy dietary guidelines better.
And something that's personalized nutrition adjacent and also in the gut health space is probiotics. 20, 30 years ago, the whole chat about the microbiome and probiotics was probably fringe hippie science, and people are taking it seriously now, as they rightly should. But this has also opened the door for charlatans and people trying to make a quick buck off selling probiotics. And I remember as a kid, I used to religiously drink Yakult every single day. I love the taste of it. And for a while, people just assumed it was a good thing to do and didn't even question the science of probiotics and these natural bacteria found in these little, tasty drinks. But now there should be some skepticism and cynicism, rightly so, because none of the data suggests that for the average person who doesn't have any specific bowel conditions, IBS or diarrhea-associated disorders, would benefit from a off-the-shelf, off-the-chilled section probiotic drink or powder or pill. So what does the evidence say about probiotics? I mean, I can't understand or fathom how a one-size-fits-all probiotic can be beneficial for everyone and why people still continue to take it.
I mean, so I should say this is not my area of expertise, so I should add that as a major disclaimer there. I mean, I guess if I offer my broader views on the microbiome, what we know and what we don't. So everyone got excited in the microbiome some time ago when scientists started doing fecal transplants of the entire microbiome. So they'd basically take the microbiome from like a mouse that is metabolically unwell, so has obesity, has diabetes, and they transfer it into a mouse that doesn't. And what they see is the phenotype. So the diabetes in the original mouse then occurs in the other mouse. So it was kind of causal data that the microbiome plays a really important role in influencing our metabolism. But here's the thing, like a microbiome, number one, is basically an organ. We consider the microbiome to be as important as an organ. And if you took the pancreas from someone with diabetes and gave it to someone who didn't have diabetes, I would not be surprised that that organ transfer caused diabetes in the recipient. I don't think anyone's arguing that an organ, whether it's the microbiome or not, is important. But what people are claiming is that you can meaningfully alter the function of an organ with nutrition. And that's what I find frustrating, because even if you look at these later studies where people have transferred the entire microbiome from one rodent to another, actually the phenotype doesn't last very long. So, for example, some studies have found that the microbiome from a rodent with insulin resistance causes insulin resistance in the recipient, but only for a few weeks. And after that, the kind of phenotype disappears. So even when you're trying to transfer the entire organ, it doesn't actually have a massive effect for over the long term. So the idea, to your point, that just taking one probiotic, one bacteria is going to alter this kind of very stubborn entire organ, to me is very, very questionable. I do know, and there are researchers in this field that I respect a lot. Kevin Whelan at King's College London is one of them, doing really good research on this. And he also is not a person to overinflate claims. And I think there is some hope that in some inflammatory bowel conditions, we might be able to use specific mixtures of these probiotics to alter in a meaningful way the microbiome to improve those symptoms. But that is very carefully defined. It's done under proper clinical trial conditions. It isn't this commercial, buy this one probiotic that we're seeing now. So in general, what do we know about the microbiome for the rest of the population? Having lots of fiber is good. That's it.
I mean, I totally agree. And in my time of prescribing medicines for patients, I have prescribed probiotics to a few patients over the years who've had specific post-bowel surgery issues or complications or specific gastroenterological conditions. And those times I've prescribed the probiotics, they've been medical grade. So, it's a prescription grade probiotic. It's like a VSL, contains the number of colony forming units of lactobacillus, etc., and it's undergone whatever regulation it needs to undergo. It's not a supplement that you can buy in a supermarket. And I think probably consumers need to know that there is a difference between, a medical professional saying probiotics can work for X, Y, and Z, and that probiotic meaning to be a prescription grade medical strength probiotic versus a pill or powder you can buy online over the counter. And for me, on one side, wanting to improve your health and looking for these hacks is one aspect. And the kind of flip side is then people demonizing little things like we mentioned before, the glucose, but also similar to the demonization of glucose is a new thing, which is, cropped up in the last couple of years of ultra processed foods. And that's a whole can of worms. And for me, I really, I guess in the grand scheme of things, if everyone had access to, enough money, we'd all be eating whole foods. Great. Sure, there's evidence saying that is great. That's not the reality. But also the reality is that some processing of foods is required to unlock the nutrition or the bioavailability or whatever. So what is the science behind ultra processed foods? And is it as bad as people claim it is, as some of these long-term, supposedly good epidemiological studies suggest they are? How can someone decide whether it's truly bad or just like a fad to worry about?
So this is really interesting, actually. And I would tie all of this stuff up in, we know 90% of what people should be doing to be healthy. And we know what the unhealthy foods are, things like cakes and donuts and crisps and all of those kinds of things, takeouts with a bunch of calories and no veggies, exercise, getting enough sleep, blah, blah, blah. That hasn't changed. And I'll introduce this topic by really summarizing everything that we've talked about, going back to the attention economy. If your goal is to get on the television, sell a book, sell a product, you've got to give people something new. You can't just say, have, fresh fruit and veg a lot, exercise, because people are like, okay, boring. You've got to come up with some new science. And I think ultra processed foods is one of these. I'm very critical of the famous book that came out last year, because there's a real overstating of the evidence. And I think it's probably very, very likely that when we're seeing these relationships in observational data between diets high in ultra processed food and negative health outcomes, it's the stuff that we know already. If you've ever worked in an office in the UK, you'll know that, 3:00 every day, often donuts come around, people are having crisps at their desks, they're having Coke. I see kids having energy drinks on the train in the morning. This is a lot of our diet, and we absolutely know high sugar, high fat, etc. I mean, Chris, who's written the ultra processed food, will say, but we know it's not just that, because we had a trial and it was done by Kevin Hall at the NIH, a wonderful researcher who I respect a lot, who showed that even if you match diets for sugar and salt and fat, the ultra processed diet causes weight gain, but the unprocessed one didn't. But if you look carefully in the supplementary data, the unprocessed diet had 7 to 8 servings of fresh fruit and veg a day, whereas the ultra processed one didn't. I mean, the ultra processed diet basically just dodged fruit and veg for 2 weeks. And again, if you look at the snacks that were offered, now why does this matter? Because what fruit and veg does is it dilutes the energy density of our meals and of what we're eating. And so energy density is calories per gram. And the whole idea about this is, if you imagine you have like meatballs and pasta, just that, mix it all together, you're going to have more calories than if you added like 3 servings of veggies, because the veggies have volume. If they're on your plate, they've got loads of volume, but they basically have no calories. So we've known for decades that if you add loads of veggies to a meal, you will dilute the energy density of that meal. Despite the volume or the weight being the same, people consume fewer calories. And actually, that's what I think Kevin Hall's study showed. So the ultra processed diet didn't have any veggies or fruit basically at all. They had double the energy density of the ultra processed diet, and research, decades of it, shows that will lead us to spontaneously overconsume calories. So that's what I think the study showed. And let me go back to what I said before. It's not new, is it? Make sure you're getting your fruit and veggies in, like add 2 servings of veggies to every single meal. So at the moment, based on most of the science, I think the ultra processed story is not adding much more than we didn't know already, is having low energy dense foods, lots of fiber, lots of fruit and veg, and avoiding high calorie, high sugar foods that cause us to overeat. Now, let me just say one final thing, because this is emerging science. We are, quite rightly, I think, looking more closely at all of the additives in our food. That previously, I think this is absolutely correct, that we have focused just on whether they are toxic, whether they might cause cancers and other things. And we haven't looked as closely as perhaps we could have at things like altering metabolism or affecting the health of the bowel. And that research is ongoing. But I've looked at some of those studies, and it's the kind of very early science that is absolutely not definitive. Let me give you one example. There was a study that gave 15 grams a day of, I think it's an emulsifier, I can't remember the name of it, in a very small exploratory study. And they found, I think it was 9 people in 2 people, but not in 7. They saw some changes in the bowel. So it's like, if you've got 9 people and something only occurs in 2, that might just be chance. It might be changes that happen. And if you did any drugs trial or early drugs work, and you had a sample size of 9, and your drug, for example, lowered glucose in 2, but it didn't in 7, we'd say that drug didn't work, right? We wouldn't be excited. So flip that around and you say, okay, so we have this emulsifier that looks like it did something in 2 people, but it didn't in 7. Like, by golly, that's not conclusive at all.
Yeah.
And so I think we absolutely should be doing research in this area, but I haven't seen anything yet that suggests that these additives are harmful.
Alluding to the ultra-processed study you suggested earlier, where they compared the ultra-processed diet versus the kind of whole foods diet, and you said it was about the energy density, and that the energy density of the ultra-processed diet was far lower. If someone were to have an ultra-processed diet, then by extrapolation of this study, but the results of this study and the outcomes, if someone had a ultra-processed diet that was rich in fiber-rich foods, for example, if that were possible, and had more of those, compounds which increase the energy density of that food, would you then hypothesize in that diet, then independent of everything else, could produce similar outcomes to the whole food diet in terms of weight gain?
I would hypothesize yes. I mean, just to be clear, there are lots of reasons why, even if you had an ultra processed food, let's say bread, for example. By the way, studies which separate ultra processed foods into categories tend to show that things like high fiber breads and cereals are either neutral or they're protective. And unsurprisingly, it's the cakes and the donuts that aren't. So yes, if we modified a processed food to lower its energy density and to make it harder, that affects the eating rate as well. I hypothesize, yes, it would not cause overeating. But I do emphasize, I still would, there's lots of reasons to have fresh fruit and veg. All of the goodness that's in them, the micronutrients and the phytonutrients are all really good for us. So there's never a circumstance when I would ever suggest not having lots of fruit and veg. But I think based on the evidence, yes, you can in fact have ultra processed foods in the diet and remain absolutely healthy. And by the way, if a study is done that shows that I'm wrong, that actually if you have ultra processed foods and you're having lots of fruit and veg, actually it still causes harm, I'll change my opinion. But as of right now, what I find so frustrating is, let's say supermarket bread. There's no data that I've seen that it's problematic. And I was quite annoyed with an interview that, let's just name him, Chris had done, and it was with The Guardian. And he talked about, with great confidence and certainty, well, we know that supermarket bread is softer. It's going to make people eat more of it. And I could believe that. And I remember reading that interview thinking, yeah, that makes sense. I wonder whether anyone's actually looked at it. And so I did a search. I did a quick literature search. I couldn't find much. I found one study, and it was done in France, and it compared, I can't remember the exact numbers, but like 7 to 10 industrial, homemade, and an in-between kind of bread. It compared lots of them, and it tested the energy density, the softness, and I think the water content, and found no differences between them. And it's like, maybe the French make even industrially, maybe they make their bread different. And I think, and I'm very cynical, that the reason people like Chris and others aren't talking about takeaways and Skittles and Doritos and food we know is rubbish is it's because that's not new. It's not going to get people to buy your book telling people stuff they already know. So you come up with this pretty controversial, oh my God, supermarket bread. And if you look at the average person in the UK's diet, I would die of shock if supermarket bread is ever shown to be remotely related to negative health outcomes ever. With the diets that we have, with the takeouts, with, like I said, the energy drinks, with the soft drinks, with the crisps, supermarket breads are probably one of the healthiest things the Brits eat. And the fact that you have a person who's, we started talking about this at the beginning, the fact that you have a doctor who's making people worry about supermarket bread, I find incredibly worrying. So maybe let me add some actionable tips. When I did my PhD, I was working 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. I ate lots of ready meals, tons of them. Supermarket, buy them at the end of the day, go home, microwave them in 3 minutes. And what I did is I'd always add, at the end of the day in the supermarket, they had carrots and those little microwavable veggie bags on offer for 70p. So I just put those in the microwave. So yes, I had my ready meal, and I tried to choose ones which are lower in salt, that had a good nutritional profile. And I made sure I had veggies on that plate. I have supermarket bread. I do occasionally enjoy making my bread, but I don't have that much time. I have supermarket bread and do not worry about it. But I'll mash an avocado on there, or I'll sometimes drizzle olive oil. I'll have lots of tomatoes and veggies and salad. I'm pretty plant-based for environmental reasons, so I have plant-based milk, ultra-processed food, but I'll have oats, I'll have nuts and seeds and raisins. I grate an apple on my cereal. So I have a reasonable amount of ultra-processed foods, but I make sure the rest of my diet is a lot of plants, a lot of fiber, and a lot of healthiness.
I think that's a perfect summary of everything. And ultimately, I believe, and I don't think it's wrong to say, that probably our stresses with curating our lifestyles and our diets and our obsession with tracking things are probably more deleterious to health outcomes than actually occasionally having supermarket bread, a donut, a ready meal, anything like that. And what is missing right now in the online space certainly is some of that nuance and less polarizing opinion that's not as sensational, that's not going to go viral, it's not as sexy. So Nicola, thank you very much for providing that balanced nuance and just, down to earth information and actionable tips as well. Thank you so much for coming on, and definitely need to have you on again because we've just scratched the surface, I feel.
Bro, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.